Alexander Isak made history for Newcastle United last night with his 8th goal in successive Premier League games, breaking the record of Joe Willock and Alan Shearer, and also taking Newcastle into the top 4 with 6 straight Premier League wins and 9 overall. Is the title race on? That's a question that's genuinely been asked. I'll answer that and also discuss some possible exits from Newcastle United in this episode of the NUFC Thursday Show. Let's get into it. Hello, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Welcome back to another episode of the NUFC Thursday Show. Lots to talk about today off the back of that huge win over Wolves last night. We'll get into all that in a minute, but please do like, share and subscribe to the channel and the videos to help me grow this channel. As I've said previously, I'm trying to get to 1,000 subscribers by the end of the season to really turbocharge this channel over the next few years. Please help support me on that journey with content coming on Newcastle United, non-Newcastle United, and also a podcast that will be coming this month, I promise. I hope you're really enjoying the content. If you are, hit like on the video as well. Can we get to 60 likes on this video? Again, thanks so much for all your support. It really does mean the world to me. But we'll get straight into it with a look back at that Wolves game last night. A huge victory that I think wasn't particularly convincing. It was a difficult start to the game. Newcastle didn't really get going. They looked a little bit nervous. And I think it reflected the change in pressure that Newcastle have got coming over the next few games. They've got Bournemouth on Saturday after Wolves. Then they've got Fulham and Southampton. There's 4 games that are extremely winnable on paper. After the Villa game, the Spurs game, the Manchester United game and the Arsenal game, where there were opportunities to win but the pressure wasn't necessarily there. Now this is a different sort of thing where they are the team that's setting the tone again, a little bit like Leicester and Ipswich. But as I say, yesterday they started a little bit sloppily. There were chances for Wolves both in the first half with Strand Larsen and Guedes, and then in the second half as well with Cunha when he came off the bench. There were opportunities that Wolves didn't take, and against the better side, Newcastle might have had some issues, but Alexander Isak scored 2 more goals, and Anthony Gordon was on the score sheet again as well, and it was a really, really comfortable evening in the end. And there was evidence of when they went through the gears and when they played through the team, and Tonali was great in midfield again. All those things were still in place. Eddie Howe talked about how they played a bit differently yesterday. Now they're starting to look like a principals team. They can play differently, they can do different things, but the team still is structured the same way. Tonali is still bossing it in midfield. Gordon's still threatening on the left. Hull and Livramento are still getting forward. Isak is still linked to Bruno in the midfield, who's high up. All of those things are there, but there's a different performance to perhaps other games, which I think is a positive, but Newcastle did ride their luck at times, I think. Nevertheless, they're into the top 4. Champions League football is very much on the horizon. Is the title race on the horizon? I think they're 12 points behind Liverpool. I haven't checked the table because, for me, they're not in the title race. I think someone braver than me can maybe make a statistical argument for it, but I think 12 points or whatever it is, and the fact that Newcastle have had issues with performances earlier in the season that might come back to bite them at some point. They're not as consistent. They don't have the mentality strength of Liverpool or even Arsenal. I think it's incredibly bold to say Newcastle are in a title race. I think they should walk before they can run. The Champions League is very much the target this season now, absolutely, and that's where they should be aiming. I don't want to personally talk about the title race in any way, shape or form, but I do want to talk about Alexander Isak because he was again absolutely superb. 2 very good goals. One was a lot of luck for him in terms of the ball deflecting into his path and then deflecting past Jose Sarr, but if you look at the defending from Wolves, the fact that he pulled out to the left and had acres of space to run into to get into the box, that was absolutely criminal from their perspective. And then the second goal was just phenomenal. The pass from Bruno, the one touch and the finish, everything we've come to expect from Isak, and everything that is really sort of taking Newcastle to a new level. And it's getting difficult to talk about how special this player is because he really is sort of a different level to everything we've seen since Alan Shearer in a striker department. He's extremely happy. Again, spoke to media this week about how happy he is at Newcastle, about how special St James's Park is, and there's all this talk about Arsenal that's constantly brought up by Arsenal fans. It's barely even really brought up by the media first. It's brought up by Arsenal fans and other clubs who really are desperate to sign him. And the entitlement, as we've mentioned, is absolutely crazy because he's on the sort of run that means that Newcastle are in a position where they can't really afford to sell him at any price, let alone in January. That's not going to happen, but it'll not happen in the summer either. What a player. Another fantastic performance. Lewis Hall and Livramento again were brilliant. I thought that Tonali was a little bit quieter, but him and Bruno still won all the second balls. It was still dominant. I thought Newcastle struggled with a little bit with Wolves' shape. They sat in deep and then pumped it long and really got at Newcastle's back four, so they were able to get in behind Tonali a few times without Tonali having anything to do with it. That was quite clever from Vitor Pereira, and I think, as I mentioned, a better team with better strikers and better confidence levels might have made Newcastle's life a little bit more difficult than Wolves did last night. But there were moments in that first half when they went through the gears and showed how good they were. Jacob Murphy was playing at full tilt on the right-hand side, and maybe that's why, and we'll get into talking about this, talk of transfers has died down a little bit until the summer, because he continues to play in that sort of way. Even if he isn't scoring or assisting goals, he's still making those runs, still doing his job very, very well. Gordon on the other side as well, linking really well with Isak, who's also linking really well with Bruno, who's also linking really well with Tonali, and then you've got the power of Joe Linton. It's a really difficult juggernaut to stop, and the great thing was that, as difficult as Newcastle found it at times last night, when they finally hit their stride, whether it was for 5-10 minutes here and there, they were very, very difficult to live with, and Wolves found it tough. So Newcastle are in a really good position. As I say, though, I don't think they're in the title race. I don't want to talk about the title race at all. I think that's really, really premature. I think it's a 12-point gap. Liverpool aren't going to drop those points. I'm not convinced Newcastle will continue this run beyond the next few games in terms of consecutive wins. I think that they're in a great position to get the Champions League football. But a great win. Newcastle are up to 4th, and they've got Bournemouth at home on Saturday. It'll be a really tough game, even though Bournemouth have got some striker issues. No Evan Nilsson, no Eris Unal. They went to Chelsea and drew 2-2. Andoni Areola has done a great job there, and that is going to be a really tough game. So Newcastle have to be on their guard. Maybe if they perform a little bit like they did yesterday at times, and they're as open as they were, then they might have difficulty in terms of keeping Bournemouth out, unlike they did Wolves. But I think Newcastle are in a great position to attack that game and then go into the Southampton game and the Fulham game. Move on to transfers, and there aren't that many incomings again to talk about. There are a couple of defenders links, but even though I said at the start of the window that I think Newcastle should attack this window, it feels a little bit at the moment like they are still very much waiting to and keeping their powder dry until the right opportunity comes up. And if that doesn't come up, then they are very happy not to spend and to attack the window earlier on in the window in the summer, because they won't have any PSR issues. Obviously, no Premier League clubs have been sanctioned this week. So Newcastle can attack the window in the summer very much so, especially if there's a couple of sales that go through. The first one we should talk about is Lloyd Kelly, £6 million bid, I think, from Fenerbahce. And Newcastle have rejected it out of hand. I think they want around 15 million to even sit down and talk about it, because of the squad depth issue, but also because he's just arrived. And lots of fans, he's had some difficult games, he's had some decent games, but he's had some difficult games. Lots of fans starting to write him off, and from a PSR perspective, it does make sense to sell him at the right price, absolutely. And I think that Newcastle are willing to sit down and talk, and the same with Miguel Almiron, who we'll get onto in a minute. But it has to be the right price. It has to be worth it. This is the whole debate we had with Martin Dubravka, and that seems to have quietened down a little bit with the Saudi move. It has to be worth it for Newcastle because of the squad depth issue, and £6 million just isn't. 15 million, maybe they'll sit down and talk about it. Will Fenerbahce come back with that fee? Who knows? It's a waiting game on that, but at the moment, Newcastle are not entertaining any deal for Lloyd Kelly, and that one doesn't feel like it's got the legs to carry on, unlike Miguel Almiron, who's been heavily linked with a return to Atlanta United. Talks have been ongoing, agreed fee apparently, the rumours this morning, for £10 million. That makes sense to me, even though lots of people are worried about the squad depth issue. If Anthony Gordon gets an injury, if Jacob Murphy gets an injury, if Alexander Isak gets an injury, there's fewer attacking players, and I do understand that. There's been a lot of attacking sales in the last couple of years, or injuries in the last couple of years, with only one addition, that being Will Asula, who isn't quite ready. So are Newcastle leaving themselves short? And the answer is probably yes, they are, but the reality is that they need to sell players, and this has always been the age-old issue for Newcastle. They need to sell players to battle the PSR issue, and they haven't done that in the past. Obviously, last year they had a bid from Bayern Munich for Kieran Trippier. Everyone had this sort of reaction, said, don't sell him, he's too important. lots of people now have regret about that. Maybe that was the right time to sell Trippier. So yes, there is a possibility that Almiron's exit could have an impact, but it's a hypothetical one at the moment. And he's played so few minutes this season, he's not really had an impact on the team. And I remember sitting in that whole press conference I keep talking about back in the summer, listening to a question about Miguel Almiron, and it gave a lot of people some nervous moments that maybe he wasn't going to go. Talked a lot about his personality, very little about how much he was going to use in this season, and as it's transpired, he's barely used him at all. If he'd gone in the summer, nobody would have batted an eyelid, and I think even though I know January is a risky situation, especially without a replacement, but if Newcastle sell him, they may look for a replacement in January, but most likely the deals that they want to do are more viable in the summer for the likes of Yohan Bakayoko, or possibly even a bigger deal for Brian Mbeumo, somebody like that. But generally, Newcastle aren't in a position where they can pick and choose their sales at that level. If they don't want to sell a Bruno, they don't want to sell an Isak, and they don't want to sell a Gordon at any point, let alone in January, then they have to look at these sales like Almiron and possibly Longstaff if a deal was possible for him. That doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. But the Almiron deal's on the table. His future is very much away from Newcastle. £10 million really does sort of make sense in the current climate. It can make a difference for PSR going into the summer, maybe more than now, because the landscape isn't quite fitting Newcastle. As I said, I thought that they may be more open to a deal in January because of what they've got on the line now. It doesn't feel like that at the moment from the club's perspective, so they're looking to wait till the summer where maybe the deals that they really want become more viable, and Almiron's sale would certainly help with that. I wouldn't be surprised if Almiron goes, but at the same time, I was convinced that Martin Dubravka was going, and that didn't happen, so we'll have to wait and see. Lloyd Kelly is a different question, I think, because of the current situation over whether Fenerbahce will come back with the right deal. That one has to be the right price, but again, that would be pure profit because he arrived for a free transfer. That would make a big difference for the summer. That's the sort of situation at Newcastle. I hope it's quite clear. If you have any questions, drop them in the comment section and I'll try my best to answer them. I think Miguel Almiron will go. I think Lloyd Kelly is a bit more of a question mark, but if the price is right, he could go as well. And I do understand the sort of questions about squad depth. It's absolutely a fair point, but Newcastle ultimately do need to start selling players, and if there are offers on the table for players who aren't regular first teamers, then they simply have to be considered. Thanks so much for joining me. Like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. I'll be back on Monday to look back at the Bournemouth game, hopefully more transfer stuff to talk about as well, and I'll see you then. Cheers.